Irene Bell slammed the document down on the scarred oak table hard enough to rattle the lantern, her dark eyes blazing with something that had no clean name: fury, grief, pride, and a desperation she had spent 3 weeks trying to swallow back down. "You lied to me," she said, and her voice was dangerously quiet. "You sat across this table, you shook my hand, and you lied to me, Abel Lawson." Abel stood at the far end of the table, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way he always did when he was trying to keep his temper from boiling over. The lantern light carved harsh shadows across his jaw, and his gray eyes had gone the color of a sky before a tornado. "I never lied to you," he said. "You told me this arrangement was temporary." Her finger pressed flat against the document, the marriage certificate that bore both their names in ink that had been dry for 6 weeks. "You told me 12 months, Abel. 12 months and I would have the deed to my father's land free and clear, and you would have the water rights you needed for your cattle, and we would part ways like two civilized people who had conducted a piece of business and nothing more." "That's still what the document says." "Then why," she said, her voice cracking for the first time, "did you go to Judge Harlan this morning and tell him you intend to contest it?" The room went silent except for the wind hitting the windows of the ranch house, and in that silence Irene watched something move across Abel Lawson's face that she was absolutely not prepared to see. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't the expression of a man caught in a betrayal. It was something raw and unguarded and terrifyingly honest. "Because 12 months isn't going to be enough time," he said. "For the water rights? No." He set his hat down on the table and looked at her directly, and the gray of his eyes had gone soft in a way that made her chest tighten in a way she deeply resented. "Not for the water rights." Irene Bell stared at Abel Lawson across that lantern-lit table in Redemption County, Texas, in the spring of 1881, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet as thoroughly as if the earth itself had swallowed a fault line. She needed to remember how they had gotten here, because the story had started very differently than this. It had started with a coffin and a lie and a letter that arrived 3 weeks too late. Irene Bell had grown up on 40 acres of good bottomland in Redemption County, the kind of land that held water through a dry summer and grew grass so thick and green it looked painted. Her father, Thomas Bell, had worked that land for 22 years, and Irene had worked it beside him for the last 12. She knew every fence post, every creek bend, every place the soil went soft in February and hard in August. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. Thomas Bell died in February of 1880, one of a chest sickness that had been working on him since November, and he died leaving behind a debt that Irene had not known existed. That was the lie, not a lie he had told her with words, but a secret he had kept with silence, which she later decided was a crueler kind of dishonesty, because she could not be angry at him now that he was gone. He had borrowed $2,000 from the Cattlemen's Land Bank of Abilene in the autumn of 1879, using the 40 acres as collateral, and he had spent that money rebuilding the main barn and buying 20 new head of cattle and putting in a proper well, all things the land needed, and he had intended to pay it back from the next 2 years of cattle sales. But the drought of 1880 had killed off 12 of the 20 cattle, and the prices for the remaining 8 had dropped to almost nothing, and Thomas Bell had spent the winter knowing the debt was called in, and that his daughter would inherit the land, and the problem simultaneously. Irene discovered all of this on the same day she buried him, when a representative from the bank rode out to offer his condolences and hand her a foreclosure notice in a single visit that struck her as one of the most efficient pieces of cruelty she had ever witnessed. She had 60 days to pay $2,000 or surrender the land. She had $47.30 and a team of horses and a small herd of 11 cattle. The letter arrived 3 weeks into her 60 days. It had been written by a man named Abel Lawson, who ran the Double L spread 12 miles north of her property, and it had been written, Irene later understood before Thomas Bell had died, addressed to her father. Thomas Bell had apparently been negotiating with Abel Lawson about water rights before he passed, and Abel Lawson had not yet heard of the death when he wrote to say that he was prepared to offer a reasonable sum for a water access easement along the southern creek that ran through the Bell property. Irene read that letter 4 times. Then she sat down at her father's desk, which still smelled of pipe tobacco and linseed oil, and she thought for a very long time. Then she wrote back, and she did not write what her father would have written. She wrote something altogether different, and she was not ashamed of it, because she was a practical woman and the situation called for practical thinking. She proposed a marriage. Not a real marriage, she was careful to clarify in the letter. She was 26 years old and she had no illusions about romance and no time for sentimentality. What she needed was a husband on paper, someone with capital enough to pay the bank debt, in exchange for which she would grant full water rights along the southern creek in perpetuity, which was worth considerably more than $2,000 to a cattle operation the size of the Double L at the end of 1 year. They would separate, and she would retain the land, and he would retain the water rights through a legal easement registered with the county, and both parties would come out ahead of where they had started. She called it a business arrangement. She waited 7 days for a response and spent those 7 days certain she had made a catastrophic miscalculation, certain the man would ride over and laugh in her face or worse, certain she had thrown away any dignity she had left. Abel Lawson's response came on the 8th day. It was brief, handwritten in a strong, even hand, and it said only, "I'll ride down Thursday. If you're serious, I'm serious. Bring the deed paperwork. A. Lawson." He arrived on Thursday at 9 in the morning on a dark bay horse with no flashy markings, which Irene took as a good sign. She had developed a theory over the years that a man who needed his horse to look impressive was compensating for something. Abel Lawson's horse was clean, well-muscled, and clearly well-fed, and the man himself was about the same tall, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair going just barely silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been put together with deliberate care. He wore his gun belt the way working men wore them, not low and dramatic but practical, sitting right where a hand could reach it without theater. He stepped down from the horse and took off his hat and said, "Miss Bell," and she said, "Mr. Lawson," and they shook hands on her porch and looked at each other for a moment with the frank appraisal of two people who are considering a significant transaction. "You want to come inside," she said. "I've got coffee and the deed papers." "That'll do," he said. They sat across the kitchen table and Irene laid out the proposal with the same directness she would have used explaining a crop rotation to a farmhand. The debt, the timeline, the land value, the water rights, the proposed arrangement, the exit terms. She watched his face while she talked and noted that he listened without interrupting, which was the second good sign. When she finished, he said, "Why marriage? Why not just a loan?" She had expected that question and she had an answer ready. Because a loan can be called in. A water rights easement granted as part of a marital property settlement is considerably harder to contest in a county court, particularly when the land in question is actively being farmed. And because the cattleman's land bank will not extend my deadline regardless of a private loan arrangement. But a husband with capital can walk into that bank and pay the debt directly without them having any grounds to object. He was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this carefully." "I have thought about very little else for 3 weeks, she said. A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make her slightly nervous. "There's one thing in your proposal that you haven't addressed," he said. "What's that? What happens if one of us doesn't want to end it at 12 months? She had not expected that question and she let a beat of silence pass before she said, carefully, "The agreement will be binding regardless of personal preferences." "Binding," he repeated as if he were testing the word. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, Miss Bell, let me ask you 2 more things and then I'll give you my answer." "Ask them." "First, is there anyone else, any other man, who has a claim on your consideration that I should know about?" "No," she said, without hesitation and without embellishment because it was simply true. "Second, Are you the kind of woman who changes the terms of a deal once it's made? She met his eyes directly. I am not. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that she would later learn revealed a great deal more than he intended them to, and then he said, "Then I think we can do business, Miss Bell." They rode into town that same afternoon and stood before Judge Harlan in the county courthouse on Redemption's Main Street, and they were married in a ceremony that took approximately 4 minutes and involved no flowers, no guests, no music, and no kiss, because Irene had specified in her written proposal that the arrangement would involve no physical expectations of any kind, and Abel had agreed to that in writing before they ever got to the courthouse. She called it a business arrangement. He signed the papers and paid $2,000 to the Cattlemen's Land Bank of Abilene 4 days later, without a flicker of financial discomfort, which told Irene something important about the scale of the Double L operation. The first week of their arrangement was the most uncomfortable of Irene Bell's adult life, and she had lived through some genuinely uncomfortable stretches. The question of living arrangements was one she had not fully anticipated when drawing up the proposal. Abel lived 12 miles north. Her land was here. They were legally married, which meant any judge reviewing the legitimacy of the arrangement, including for purposes of the water rights easement, might look skeptically at a married couple who lived 12 miles apart and never shared a roof. Abel raised this practicality without drama or implication on the second day after the wedding, when he rode over to check on the fence line along the southern creek and found her in the middle of repairing a broken gate hinge. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping down from his horse and picking up the other side of the gate without being asked, "about the living situation." "I've been thinking about it too," she said, keeping her eyes on the hinge pin she was pressing back into place. "I have a spare room. It has a proper bed and a window and a latch on the door." "I wasn't going to suggest anything that required a latch," he said mildly. She looked up at him. He was holding the gate steady with exactly the right pressure and looking at her with an expression that managed to be both serious and completely non-threatening. "I know you weren't," she said after a moment. "But I'm mentioning it so that we both know the terms are clear." "Terms are clear," he agreed. He moved into the spare room on Friday. He brought one saddlebag of personal belongings and a rifle and a small wooden box that he set on the windowsill without explanation, and which Irene much later, discovered contained a daguerreotype of his mother and a pocket watch that had belonged to his brother. He was, she discovered, an extraordinarily easy person to share a house with. He was quiet in the mornings and did not require conversation before he had his coffee, which suited her perfectly. He pulled his own weight on the property without being asked and without making a performance of it. He simply saw what needed doing and did it, and when she was already doing something he would take the other half of the job without discussion, the way he had taken the gate. He did not pry. He did not ask about her father's death or the bank debt or any of the details of her life that she had not offered. He answered questions when she asked them and went quiet when she went quiet and treated her, she realized after the first week, with a respect that was so consistent and unself-conscious that it took her several days to name it properly. He treated her like a person. That sounds like a small thing. In 1881 in Redemption County, Texas, it was not a small thing. 2 weeks into the arrangement, they developed a routine that settled over the house like something that had been there for years. Irene made breakfast because she woke earliest and because she was a better cook, and Abel took the early morning ride to check the cattle and fencing because he was a better horseman and because he genuinely did not mind the cold. They would reconvene at the kitchen table for breakfast, and she would have already spread out the day's list of tasks, and they would divide them with the efficient shorthand of people who had somehow learned to read each other's logic quickly. It was not romantic. She was very clear with herself that it was not romantic. It was a functional domestic arrangement in service of a legal and financial agreement, and she was not going to muddy it with sentiment. But she noticed things. She noticed that when he laughed, which was not frequent but not rare either, it changed his whole face. the way a window does when you throw open the shutters. She noticed that he read, which surprised her, books borrowed from the town's small lending library, and that he read them seriously with a stub of pencil in his hand sometimes, marking passages. She noticed that he was patient with the horses to a degree that told her more about his character than most of what he said aloud. She noticed that he smelled of pine soap and horses, and occasionally when he had been working outdoors in the cold, of the sharp, clean scent of cedar wood. She stopped noticing these things. Aggressively. The crisis came in week 4, and it came from a direction Irene had not anticipated, which was the direction of her nearest neighbor, a man named Gerald Prout, who farmed the 30 acres to the east of her property, and who had, she knew, been angling to acquire the Bell land since before her father died. Gerald Prout rode over on a Tuesday morning when Abel was out working the back pasture fence and found Irene in the yard hanging washing on the line. He was a man of about 50, heavyset and sunburned, with small clever eyes and a smile that he used like a tool. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, climbing down from his horse with the ease of a man arriving at his own property. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Bell Lawson now. Congratulations on the marriage. Surprised us all, I can tell you." "Good morning, Gerald," she said, because she had been raised to be civil. "I'll get to the point," he said, in the tone of a man who had never in his life gotten to the point. "I know about the bank business. I know your father borrowed against the land, and I know he wasn't able to cover it. I want you to know that I made an offer to the bank myself, before your arrangement with Lawson came together, and I think you and I might have some interesting things to discuss about the future of this property." Irene kept her hands moving on the washing line. "The debt is paid and the land is mine," she said. "There's nothing to discuss." "The land is yours for now," Prout said pleasantly. "But 12 months is a long time and arrangements have a way of falling apart. I just want you to know that when they do, I'll be a fair buyer." Irene turned and looked at him then fully, and let him see what was behind her eyes. "Gerald, if you rode over here to tell me that my marriage is temporary and my land will eventually be available, you've made a 12-mile trip for nothing. Go home." Something shifted in his face, the pleasantness going thin. "Word travels in a small county, Irene. People talk. People always talk," she said. "It doesn't change the deed paperwork. Good morning." He left, but he left slowly, and with the bearing of a man who was postponing rather than abandoning, and Irene hung the rest of the washing with her jaw set and her mind moving very quickly. That evening she told Abel what had happened, because whatever the terms of their arrangement, it was information he needed. He listened without interrupting, as was his habit, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment with his coffee cup in both hands, looking at the table. "How much does he want the land?" Abel asked. "He's wanted it for years. The Southern Creek runs along my property line. If he had my 40 acres, he'd have the best water access in the county without needing to deal with your easement at all. So he's got motive to see our arrangement fail." "Yes." Abel looked up at her. "Then we make sure it doesn't look like it's failing," he said. "We go into town more, we're seen together, we act like a married couple." Something in the word act caught in her throat and she pushed past it. "Agreed," she said. "It's a practical precaution." "Practical," he agreed, but something shifted after that conversation. Something that neither of them named or addressed or acknowledged, which was the way both of them seemed to prefer to handle things that were complicated. They began going into redemption on Saturdays. It was a small town, one main street with a general store, a post office, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a smithy, a church, and the courthouse where they had been married. People noticed them, as people in small towns always notice things, and Irene became aware that they were being watched with the particular intensity that a community reserves for a surprise marriage between two people who have not played by the expected rules. She held his arm on the main street, which was practical, because the boardwalks were uneven and the mud in spring was treacherous, and it had nothing to do with the fact that his arm was solid and warm and made her feel, in a way she refused to examine, like something she had been holding up for a long time could rest for a moment. He kept his hand over hers in the easy way of a man who was comfortable with her, not possessive, not performing, just present. 3 Saturdays in, he bought her a small paper bag of lemon drops from the general store without explanation, and when she looked at him he said, "I saw you looking at them last week," and went on loading the supply list into the wagon. And Irene Bell stood on the boardwalk of Redemption's Main Street in April of 1881, holding a bag of lemon drops, and felt something crack open in the carefully constructed wall she had built around the practical business arrangement she had made with this man. She ate 3 of them on the ride home and handed him the bag, and he ate 2 without looking at her, and they rode the rest of the way in a comfortable silence that felt, against her will and better judgment, like happiness. It was in week 6 that the real danger arrived. Not Gerald Prout, not the bank. The real danger arrived in the form of a man named Cole Dexter, who rode into Redemption County from the direction of Abilene on a Wednesday afternoon, and who was, Irene discovered when she went into town for flour and found herself standing 3 feet away from him at the general store counter, someone she recognized. Cole Dexter had known her father. More specifically, he had been one of 3 men who had swindled her father out of a section of grazing land back in 1875, using a forged land transfer document and the complicity of a crooked county clerk who had since conveniently died and taken all the evidence with him. Her father had never recovered the land and had never been able to prove the swindle, and it had been one of the wounds that had festered quietly in him for the rest of his life. Cole Dexter was about 45, lean as wire, with a wide smile and a reputation in multiple counties for being the kind of man who found the edges of the law and lived comfortably on them. He looked at Irene Bell across the general store counter with instant recognition and a smile that made her skin crawl. "Irene Bell," he said, "I heard you'd married a Lawson. How's your father keeping?" "My father is dead," she said. He arranged his face into something resembling condolence. "Sorry to hear that. Tom was a good man." "He was," she said, "a very good man who was cheated by very poor ones." The smile did not waver. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Lawson." "It's a statement of fact," she said. "What brings you to Redemption County, Mr. Dexter?" "Business," he said easily. "Land business, as it happens." She paid for her flour and left without another word, but her hands were not entirely steady on the wagon reins on the drive home, and when she got back to the ranch and found Abel in the barn checking a horse with a stone bruise on its left forefoot, she stood in the barn doorway until he looked up, and she told him everything. Not just Cole Dexter at the general store. Everything. The 1875 land swindle, her father's loss, what it had done to him, all of it. The whole hidden chapter she had kept to herself, because she was a private person, and because she had been managing her own problems for as long as she could remember. Abel listened with his hand still resting on the horse's fetlock, completely still, watching her face. When she finished, there was a silence that she could not read, and then he said, "You were carrying that the whole time." It was not a question, and it was not a reprimand, and the way he said it with something that sounded almost like it hurt him made her throat close. "It has nothing to do with our arrangement," she said. He stood up slowly. "Irene." She did not know what she expected him to say next, but what he said was, "If this man is in the county for land business, he's here because he knows about the debt and the marriage, and he thinks there's an angle to work. That means he's a problem for both of us." Back to practicality, she breathed in. "Yes. Then we deal with it together," he said. "That's what the arrangement covers." She nodded because it was the sensible response. But something was happening underneath the sensible response, something warm and complicated and entirely inconvenient. And she lay awake that night in her room with the sound of the wind over the plains and thought about the way he had said, "You were carrying that the whole time," and what it had meant that he noticed. Cole Dexter's angle revealed itself within the week. He had, it turned out, formed a partnership with Gerald Prout, who was apparently more resourceful than Irene had credited. And together they had discovered that Thomas Bell's 1875 land loss had been recorded using a document that could be challenged, not to restore the land to the Bell estate, but to create a legal cloud over the title of the current 40 acres that might be enough to make the Lawson marriage arrangement's foundational land claim uncertain. It was a complicated legal trap, the kind that required a crooked approach and a sympathetic audience, and it was designed to force Irene into a position where her only exit was to sell to Prout at Prout's price. The man who explained this to Abel and Irene was a lawyer named James Calder, who practiced out of redemption, and who was the most honest man in the county by simple virtue of being the only lawyer in the county, with nothing else to do besides be honest. He was about 60, slight, with spectacles and a dry manner, and he laid out the situation across his office desk with the air of someone describing a complex weather pattern. "It will not succeed," he said, "provided the marriage and the water rights transfer can be demonstrated to constitute a legitimate domestic partnership and not a purely commercial transaction. The legal challenge will rely on arguing that the marriage was contracted solely for financial purposes and therefore does not constitute a valid basis for the land claims attached to it." There was a silence. Irene and Abel were sitting side by side across from the lawyer's desk, and she could feel the tension in him without looking at him. "And how does one demonstrate a legitimate domestic partnership?" Abel asked, carefully. Calder looked at them over his spectacles. "The same way one always does in a county court in 1881. Consistent cohabitation, community witnesses who can attest to the ordinary conduct of the marriage, documentation of shared domestic arrangements." He paused. "And ideally, no public statements from either party that could be construed as characterizing the marriage in primarily commercial terms." Another silence. Irene kept her eyes on the lawyer's desk. "We'll do what's necessary," Abel said. On the ride home, they were quiet for a long time. The afternoon light was going golden over the plains, and the mockingbirds were loud in the brush along the creek, and Irene was aware of Abel on the wagon seat beside her with an acute, uncomfortable clarity. "You didn't sign up for a legal battle," she said eventually. "No," he agreed, "but here we are. I'll understand if you want to renegotiate the terms." He turned and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. It was not the calm practicality she was used to. It was something more direct and, she thought, slightly annoyed. "Irene," he said, "stop looking for the exit." She looked at him. "You've been doing it since the beginning," he said. "Every time something complicated comes up, you start pointing toward the door in case I want to use it. I don't want to use it. I'm going to tell you that once more, and after that I'm going to assume you've taken it in." She opened her mouth and closed it again. Then she said very quietly, "Why not?" He looked back at the road, at the horse's ears moving against the late light, and he said, "Because I made a deal and I keep my deals." A pause. "And because I don't want to." She held the second half of that answer carefully, like something that might break, and did not ask him to clarify it, because she was not sure she was ready for the clarification. The weeks that followed were the most unexpected of Irene Bell's life, and she had been living an unexpected life for some time. The practical requirements of demonstrating a legitimate marriage meant that they were more in each other's company in public, which meant they were more in each other's company privately as well, because you cannot turn the appearance of closeness off and on like a lamp. It has to come from somewhere real, or people can tell. And something was real. She had known it was real for a while. She had been extremely strategic about not examining it. Abel began teaching her to play chess on the evenings when the work was done, and the light had gone from the sky, setting the board up on the kitchen table with the careful precision of a man who had learned from someone who cared about the game. She was a fast learner and competitive by nature, and she beat him for the first time in the third week of playing, and his reaction, a slow, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of those gray eyes, was so unexpectedly delightful that she laughed before she could stop herself. "I wasn't going easy on you," he said with dignity. I know you weren't, she said, still laughing. That's why it's so satisfying. He shook his head, but he was smiling, and he reset the board immediately because he was the kind of man who responded to losing by wanting to try again. He told her things gradually, the way a man tells things when he has been quietly deciding for some time that a person is trustworthy. He told her about growing up on a smaller spread in West Texas, the third of 4 sons. He told her about his brother Daniel, who had died of a fever at 32 and whose pocket watch lived in the wooden box on the windowsill. He told her about the 5 years he had spent building the Double L from 100 acres and a handful of cattle into the operation it was now, working it with 2 hired hands and a stubbornness that he described without pride, just as a plain fact. He had never been married before. He told her this on a night in May when they were sitting on the porch after supper and the sky was enormous and full of stars, and he told it without apparent self-consciousness, as a piece of information rather than a confession. Neither had I, she said. Obviously. It's not obvious, he said. You're 26 and you're the kind of woman men want to marry. She looked at him. Is that meant to be a compliment? It's meant to be accurate, he said. You're capable and direct and honest, and you're the hardest working person I've encountered. Those are qualities a man with any sense values. She did not know what to do with that sentence, so she looked back at the stars. Well, she said, the arrangement has the virtue of covering the subject. Does it? He said. Not exactly a question. She did not answer it. The stars burned steadily overhead and the creek made its quiet sound along the property line, and Abel Lawson did not push the subject, which was one of the things about him that she found, paradoxically, most difficult to defend herself against. He never pushed. He was simply there, consistent and unhurried, like good water that finds its level eventually. The court challenge from Prout and Dexter was filed in the 3rd week of May. James Calder had prepared for it and was not alarmed, and he told them as much when they sat in his office and reviewed the filings. The challenge was on thin legal ground, and he was confident in his counterarguments, but he needed them to be prepared to testify about the nature of their domestic arrangement, and he needed them to understand that a county court in Texas in 1881 would be listening not just to legal arguments but to the human story. Judges are people, Calder said, removing his spectacles and polishing them with the air of a man about to say something important. And people in this county will look at 2 young people who were sensible enough to recognize each other's value and make a practical arrangement, and they will call that honest frontier good sense. What they will not want to hear is that the arrangement was cold and commercial. You understand me? We understand you, Abel said. On the ride home, Irene said, we are going to have to be convincing. We are, he agreed, which means we are going to have to talk about some things we haven't talked about. I know, he said, a long pause. The road stretched ahead of them through the late afternoon light. Abel, she said, what exactly do you feel about this arrangement? It was as direct as she could manage, and it was not as direct as she would have liked, because the real question had too many words in it that she was not ready to say. He drove for a moment without answering, and she had learned enough about him by then to know that his silences were not avoidance. They were just the time it took him to find the accurate words. I feel, he said slowly, that I agreed to a 12-month arrangement, and that somewhere around week 3 I started hoping it would be longer. Another pause. And that I have been keeping that to myself because the terms were clear, and I don't change terms without consent. The warmth that moved through her at those words was immediate and overwhelming and frightening. That's a very careful way of saying something, she said. Yes, he agreed, because it's a careful thing. She looked at the horse's ears and the road ahead and the hills going purple in the late light, and she thought about a dead father and a bank debt and a letter and a man who came on a Thursday morning with a practical horse and no speeches. And she thought about chess on the kitchen table and lemon drops, and the way he had said, you were carrying that the whole time. I think, she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended, that the arrangement has become complicated for me as well." He looked at her then, full and direct, and the gray of his eyes had gone soft and certain all at once. "Complicated how?" he said. "Complicated in the direction of not wanting it to end," she said. He let out a slow breath like something releasing. "All right," he said, and then, after a moment, "Good." That was all. 2 words, "good," and the horses walked on in the golden afternoon. And Irene Bell felt something she had not felt since before her father died, which was that the future held something other than a problem to solve. They did not make proclamations. They did not suddenly become a different kind of people. But things shifted, quietly, the way spring shifts into summer. You don't see the moment it happens. You just notice one day that the light is longer and the air is warmer, and something that was cold has gone completely, undeniably warm. He started leaving the wooden box on the windowsill open, not as an invitation, but as the unconscious gesture of a man who has stopped keeping certain things closed. She noticed it the way she noticed most things he did, carefully and privately. And one evening she asked him about the pocket watch, and he took it out and showed it to her, and told her about Daniel without the careful distance he usually kept around painful subjects. She told him about her mother, who had died when Irene was 14, and whom she missed in the specific, permanent way of a person who has had to grow up faster than planned. She told him about the 12 years of working the land alongside her father, which she had loved, and which had been lonely in equal measure. She told him about the dreams she had for the 40 acres, the expanded garden, the fruit trees she wanted to plant along the eastern fence line, the possibility of keeping a small dairy operation that could give her some financial independence through the leaner cattle years. He listened to all of it with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered to him, and at the end he said, "The creek access would support a bigger garden. I can help you run the water lines if you want them extended." She smiled. "That's very practical. I'm a practical man," he said with the hint of that smile. "You're also," she said carefully, "other things." He looked at her. "You're kind," she said. "Consistently kind, which is actually rarer than practical. And you're honest, even about things that are uncomfortable to be honest about. And you read books with pencils in your hand, and you're patient with horses, and you taught me chess, and you bought me lemon drops without making it an occasion." She stopped because she had said more than she intended, and her heart was going too fast. He set down his coffee cup and reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight of the kitchen, while the Texas night made its sounds outside the windows, and it was the quietest and most completely certain she had felt in a very long time. The court hearing was set for the first week of June. In the days before it, Irene found herself oscillating between calm confidence and a fear that went deeper than the legal question. The fear that whatever Cole Dexter and Gerald Pruitt had set in motion might expose the history of the arrangement in a way that would unravel something that had, against all the practical logic she had originally applied to it, become essential to her. James Calder prepared them thoroughly. He had gathered testimony from the proprietor of the general store, who could attest to their regular Saturday visits, from the Reverend at Redemption's Church, who had seen them at Sunday service 3 times since April, from 2 neighboring families who had observed the ordinary conduct of the Lawson household with the attentiveness that neighbors in small communities always apply to each other's business. "The case is solid," Calder told them. "What I need from you is composure in the courtroom. Do not volunteer information. Answer the questions you are asked. Be straightforward and be yourselves." "Be ourselves," Abel said, with a dryness that made Irene almost smile. "Precisely," Calder said, with the air of a man who had not registered the irony. The courtroom in Redemption's county courthouse was a single large room with wooden pews for spectators, and a raised bench for the judge, and a smell of old paper and dust that had probably been there since the building went up in 1869. It was full on the morning of the hearing, because small towns do not often produce entertainment as interesting as a land dispute wrapped in a surprise marriage, and Irene walked in on Abel's arm with her back straight and her chin level, and told herself that she was not nervous. Gerald Prout sat with his lawyer on one side of the center aisle, heavy and self-assured. Cole Dexter sat beside him with his wide smile. They both looked at Irene when she came in with the particular look of men who believe they have found a way to win. Judge Harlan, the same judge who had married them 4 months earlier, took his seat and looked over the courtroom with the bored authority of a man who has heard every variation of this kind of dispute before and finds them uniformly tedious. The challenge from Prout and Dexter rested on 2 arguments. First, that the 1875 land transaction could be used to create a title cloud over the Bell property, and second, that the Lawson marriage was a commercial arrangement rather than a genuine domestic partnership, and therefore could not serve as the legal basis for the water rights easement recorded at the county. Calder demolished the first argument in about 45 minutes with the kind of methodical legal precision that Irene found genuinely impressive, presenting documentation that showed the 1875 transaction, while ethically questionable, had no bearing on the current deed title under Texas property law. The second argument was more personal. Prout's lawyer, a man from Abilene named Fitch who had the satisfied air of someone accustomed to winning, called on a witness that Irene had not anticipated. A woman named Mildred Shaw, who ran a boarding house in town, and who claimed to have spoken with Thomas Bell shortly before his death, and to have heard him say that his daughter had been considering approaching Abel Lawson about some kind of arrangement regarding the land. Fitch argued that this demonstrated premeditation of a commercial nature. Calder objected, and was sustained on the grounds that hearsay from a deceased person carried no legal weight. But the implication had been laid before the court, and Irene saw several people in the spectator pews lean forward with the heightened interest of people who have just been given a reason to doubt. Then Fitch called Irene herself. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and answered Fitch's questions in the direct, careful way she answered all questions, watching his face for the angle he was working toward. He asked about the timeline of the marriage. She answered. He asked about the bank debt. She answered. He asked whether, at the time of the marriage, she had communicated to Abel Lawson any proposal regarding the land and water rights. She said yes. He asked her to characterize the nature of that proposal. She said it had been a practical arrangement intended to address mutual needs. He asked her if she would characterize it as a commercial transaction. She looked at Fitch across the courtroom and she said, no. He asked her why not. She said, because a commercial transaction is 2 people exchanging goods or services for monetary value and feeling nothing beyond the exchange. That is not what happened. He asked her what had happened. She looked at Abel, who was sitting beside Calder at their table, and he was looking back at her with those gray eyes that she now knew as well as she knew the creek sounds and the morning light over the Bell 40 acres, and she said, what happened is that a practical arrangement between 2 honest people turned into something that neither of them planned for and both of them chose to keep. The courtroom was very quiet. Fitch pressed. He asked if she was claiming that the marriage was founded on emotional attachment. She said she was claiming that it had arrived there, which was more honest and more important than where it started. Abel was called next. Fitch asked him the same kinds of questions, probing for the commercial framing, looking for a crack in the story. Abel answered everything quietly and without drama, and when Fitch asked him why he had agreed to a proposal that was explicitly framed as a business arrangement by the woman who made it, Abel said, because she was right that it was mutually beneficial, and because I had the sense to recognize that being mutually beneficial and being real are not mutually exclusive things. Fitch asked if he intended to honor the 12-month dissolution that had been part of the original proposal. Abel said, no. Fitch looked as though he had found something. Can you explain why not? Abel said, because I spoke with Judge Harlan this morning and filed an intent to contest the original dissolution timeline on the grounds that the terms of the arrangement have materially changed. This was the moment Irene had been at the beginning of this whole story, at the table with the lantern and the marriage certificate in her blazing eyes, before she had understood what it meant. She understood it now. She felt it move through her, not the anger she had felt that morning before the hearing, but something entirely different, something that felt like being seen from a distance and recognized. Judge Harlan adjusted his spectacles and looked at Abel over them. "Is that correct, Mr. Lawson? You filed that notice this morning." "Yes, Your Honor," Abel said. "On what grounds?" Abel looked at Irene then, directly, openly, with everything in his face unhidden for once. "On the grounds that I am not going to agree to dissolve a marriage that has become the best decision I have ever made," he said, "regardless of the terms of the original proposal." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harlan restored order with his gavel, and the practiced displeasure of a man who has been handling Redemption County for 20 years. He looked at Fitch and at Calder and at Pruitt and at Dexter, and then he looked at the Lawsons, and he said, in the tone of a man who has already made his decision, "I'm going to need 5 minutes." He took 4. When he came back, he dismissed the challenge in its entirety. The title cloud argument had no legal standing. The commercial arrangement argument had been undermined by the testimony of both parties themselves, neither of whom had presented as people engaged in a cold commercial transaction. And a filed notice of intent to contest dissolution was itself evidence of ongoing commitment to the marital arrangement. The gavel came down. Fitch gathered his papers with the controlled fury of a man who intended to appeal and knew he had no grounds. Gerald Pruitt left without looking at Irene. Cole Dexter left with his wide smile still in place, which was somehow worse, but also somehow less threatening than it had been, because Irene was looking at it from the other side of something significant. Calder shook both their hands with the quiet satisfaction of a man who likes winning. "Congratulations," he said. "On both counts, I think." Outside the courthouse on Redemption's Main Street in the full morning sun of June 1881, Irene Bell and Abel Lawson stood on the boardwalk and looked at each other. "You filed the notice this morning," she said. "I did," he said, "before the hearing, before you knew how I would testify." "Yes." That was a significant assumption about how I felt. He was quiet for a moment. "It was," he agreed. "Are you angry?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about all things. She thought about the lantern-lit table that morning before the hearing when she had slammed the marriage certificate down and accused him of lying to her before he had told her what the filing actually meant. She thought about the moment in the courtroom when she had understood. "No," she said. "I was angry for about 20 minutes this morning, and then I listened to you in that courtroom and stopped. I should have told you before I filed it." "Yes," she said, "you should have." A pause. "But I understand why you didn't, because it was a risk and you weren't sure what my answer would be, and that kind of uncertainty is very uncomfortable for a practical man." Something in his face shifted. "It's uncomfortable for any kind of man," he said. She stepped closer to him on the boardwalk, and she put her hand on his arm and she said, quietly, "Abel, I told a courtroom full of people today that what happened between us is real. I need you to know that I meant it." He covered her hand with his, and the warmth of it was as familiar now as the creek sound or the morning light. "I know you meant it," he said. "You don't say things you don't mean." "I want to plant the fruit trees," she said. He blinked. "The fruit trees along the eastern fence line." "Yes, the ones I told you about. I want to plant them this autumn so they're established by next spring. I need your help with the soil preparation because the ground along that fence line is compacted." He looked at her with that particular expression, the one that was almost a smile but warmer. "You're telling me you're staying," he said. "I'm telling you I want to plant fruit trees that will take 2 years to establish," she said. "I think that's fairly clear." "Irene Bell," he said, and the way he said her name had something in it she would remember for the rest of her life. "It is absolutely clear." He leaned down and kissed her, there on the main street of Redemption, Texas, in the June sun of 1881, and it was not anything like the 4-minute courthouse ceremony. It was the kind of kiss that people on the boardwalk immediately stopped pretending not to look at, and Irene put her free hand against his chest and felt his heart going fast, which was enormously satisfying because hers was doing the same thing, and it was deeply comforting not to be the only one. When they separated, Mrs. Aldrich from the general store said audibly from 3 storefronts down, "Well, it's about time," and someone laughed. And Abel laughed too, quietly, and Irene smiled against her own will. "Take me home," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They rode home through the June afternoon with the creek winking in the distance and the sky enormous and clean, and neither of them talked very much because there was nothing urgent left to say. All the urgent things had been said in the courthouse and on the boardwalk, and in all the weeks of chess games and lemon drops and shared mornings that had added up, without either of them declaring a plan, into a life. The matter of Gerald Prout resolved itself less dramatically than Irene had expected. With the legal challenge failed and the water rights easement registered with the county, Prout's ambitions regarding the Bell property had no remaining avenue, and he seemed to understand this, because he withdrew to his 30 East acres and was not heard from for some time. Cole Dexter left Redemption County within a week of the courthouse ruling, which was neither a surprise nor a loss. The Cattlemen's Bank had been paid and wanted nothing further to do with either of them. James Calder sent a bill that was very reasonable, which Abel paid, and when Irene said she would repay him from the first cattle sales of autumn, he said, "Or you could stop keeping accounts between us." And she said, "Old habits," and he said, "New arrangements," and she gave him a look that was mostly affectionate. The summer of 1881 was a good one on the Bell property. The cattle were healthy, and the grass came up thick after the spring rains, and the creek ran clear and steady along the property line, serving both the Bell 40 acres and the Double L's southern pastures, with the dependability that had made the water rights valuable in the first place. Abel divided his time between the 2 properties with the ease of a man who did not mind distance when the destination was right. He kept 2 horses at the Bell barn and rode the 12 miles to check on the Double L and its 2 hired hands, brothers named Pete and Cal Danning, who had worked the spread for 3 years and who, Irene eventually gathered, thought very highly of Abel and had been privately delighted by the turn his life had taken, though they were far too careful of their jobs to say so in front of him. She rode with him to the Double L for the first time in July, and stood at the fence of its main pasture watching 200 cattle graze in the afternoon light, and understood for the first time the scale of what Abel had built alone in 5 years, and felt something that was not quite pride. She had no claim on the Double L's success, but was adjacent to it, in the way that witnessing excellence in someone you love produces something very like personal satisfaction. She had used the word, even internally, without hesitation by then. Love. It had come to her without ceremony around the time of the courthouse, and had settled in like something that had been waiting for permission. She told him this in August, on a night when the summer storms came rolling in from the southwest, with lightning running in the clouds and the air smelling of rain coming. And they were sitting on the porch watching it approach the way West Texans always watch storms, with respect and a calculated sense of when to go inside. She said it matter-of-factly in the direct Irene Bell way, as if it were a piece of information he needed rather than a dramatic declaration, because she was still fundamentally herself regardless of what summer had done to her walls. "I want you to know," she said, watching the lightning, "that this isn't the arrangement anymore. For me. I want you to know what it is for me." "What is it?" he said. "It's what it is," she said, which was not as articulate as she would have liked, so she added, "I love you, which is not something I was planning on and is not something I have any particular experience with, but it is accurate and I thought you should have the information." He turned and looked at her with those gray eyes and the storm coming behind him, and he said, "Irene," in the tone he used when she had done something that moved him past his usual composure. "I know," she said, because she did know, had known for a while, the same way she had known about the lemon drops and the pocket watch and the filing at the courthouse. "I have loved you," he said, "since about the third week of February when you came out to the barn and told me about Cole Dexter and your father's land, and I watched you carry 12 years of unfairness in your posture and still be completely steady, and I thought I have never in my life met anyone quite like her." She was quiet for a moment. "That was week 4, she said. "It was the beginning of March." "I stand corrected," he said gravely. "I've loved you since week 4. "That's earlier than I thought," she said. "That's because you were busy being practical," he said, and she laughed, and the storm broke over the 40 acres in a rush of wind and warm rain, and they went inside and stood in the kitchen doorway with the rain hitting the porch boards and the lightning walking across the plains, and he put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into him and felt, completely and simply, that she was home. They made the arrangements formal in September, or rather, they made the informal formal by making decisions they had been quietly building toward all summer. Abel sold a parcel of the Double L's northern range that was farthest from the water access and had always been the least productive, and used the proceeds to hire a third hand and a proper foreman for the Double L so it could run efficiently in his extended absence. He moved his remaining personal belongings from the spare room to the main bedroom, which required no ceremony and produced no awkwardness, because, by that point, it was simply the logical next step in an arrangement that had long since stopped being an arrangement and become something else entirely. The fruit trees were planted in October, a dozen apple trees and 8 peach trees along the eastern fence line, going into the ground with the careful attention to soil and spacing that Irene had planned for years. Abel helped with the compacted ground preparation, breaking it up over 3 days with the methodical persistence he brought to all physical work, and Irene planted each tree with the sense of someone committing to a future in the most literal possible way. "They'll bear fruit in 2 years, she said, pressing the last of the soil around the final peach tree as the October sun went low. "That's a long time to wait," he said, leaning on his shovel. "Good things usually take some time," she said. He smiled at her over the last peach tree. "Is that a general statement or a specific one?" "Both," she said. November brought the first real cold and the news that Irene was expecting, which came to her with a combination of joy and terror that she navigated in her characteristic direct fashion. She walked into the kitchen where Abel was drinking his morning coffee and said, "I need to tell you something important," and told him, and watched his face. What happened to Abel Lawson's face in that moment was something Irene would keep in her memory like a pressed flower between pages. The sheer, uncomplicated joy of it, immediate and unguarded, and as far from composed as she had ever seen him. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and put his arms around her and held on, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt him breathe, and neither of them said anything for a long time because everything necessary was being communicated in a language that had no words. "Are you frightened?" he asked, eventually into her hair. "A little," she admitted because she was honest. "Me too," he said. "But mostly not," she added. "Me too," he said again, and she could feel him smiling against her hair. She was mostly well through the winter, which was a mercy she was grateful for, because the Bell property needed consistent attention, and she was not a person who adapted easily to being managed or protected, which Abel was wise enough to understand without being told. He was present and attentive without being hovering, helped with the heavier work without making a production of it, and treated her as the capable person she was while also making it clear, quietly, consistently, in the Abel Lawson way, that she was not managing any of it alone. The Double L's new foreman, a steady man named Harding who had managed cattle operations in 2 other counties, proved himself reliable and competent, which freed Abel considerably. He was at the Bell property more than the Double L now, and Irene had stopped thinking of them as separate properties in any meaningful sense. They were 2 pieces of something that functioned together, like the creek that ran between them, serving both. In December, Gerald Prout put his 30 East acres up for sale and moved his family to San Antonio. Irene heard this from Mrs. Aldrich at the general store and felt nothing in particular about it, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she had not been certain of. James Calder, when he heard the news, said to Abel at the post office, "Seems like a story with a proper ending." And Abel said, "One of several." And Calder looked at Irene's clearly expecting figure and had the decency to look pleased. Their son was born in June of 1882, 14 months after the 4-minute courthouse ceremony that Irene Bell had once summarized as a business arrangement, and Abel Lawson had almost immediately stopped thinking of as anything of the kind. They named him Thomas, for her father. He arrived in the early morning with the June light coming through the bedroom windows, and a doctor named Presley, who had ridden 20 miles from the larger town of Caldera, and who was, Irene decided afterward, worth every cent of his considerable fee. Abel was in the room throughout, because Irene had not been willing to have him anywhere else, and because he was not the kind of man to retreat from something important simply because it was difficult. And he held her hand, and she held his with the grip of a woman who is competent and frightened simultaneously. And he did not say a single useless thing the entire time, which she later told him was one of his most admirable qualities. Thomas Bell Lawson was born at 6 in the morning and weighed 8 pounds, and announced his arrival with a sound that cleared the entire house of any remaining quiet. Irene held him with the careful intensity of a new mother and looked at his face, her nose, she thought, and something around the eyes that was pure Bell, but the shape of his brow unmistakably Lawson, and felt the love hit her like weather, enormous and all at once. Abel sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his son with an expression that completed the circle of what she had felt on the courthouse steps, in the kitchen with the storm, under the October sun by the last peach tree. This was what all of it had been building toward, not the land or the water rights or the legal arrangement or even the love that had grown out of it. This particular morning in this particular room with this person beside her and this new person between them. "He looks like you," Abel said. "He has your brow," she said. "Thomas," Abel said to the baby quietly with a reverence that was different from anything she had heard in his voice before. "Thomas Lawson." "Thomas Bell Lawson," Irene said. "Thomas Bell Lawson," he agreed, and looked up at her with those gray eyes warm and certain, and exactly what she had come to know as home. "Hello, Tom." The apple trees put out their first blossoms in the spring of 1883, 14 months after the planting, which was ahead of the 2-year estimate. The peach trees would take another season, but the apple blossoms came on fast and thick along the eastern fence line, white and pink against the blue Texas sky, and Irene stood among them one April morning with Thomas on her hip, 11 months old and enormously interested in everything, grabbing at the blossoms with a determination that was pure Lawson, and felt the satisfaction of having planted something for the future and lived long enough to see it respond. Abel came around the fence line from the direction of the creek and stopped when he saw them among the blossoms, and he stood still for a moment in the way he sometimes did when something hit him before he had arranged his face for it. "They came in early," Irene said. "They did," he said, walking toward her. He took Thomas from her hip, which Thomas allowed with the easy trust he had for his father, and he put his free arm around Irene's shoulders, and she leaned into him in the blossom-lit morning, and looked at the 40 acres that had been her father's grief and her inheritance and her bargaining chip and her home, all in sequence. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question was simple and direct, which was very like him, and it deserved a simple and direct answer. "Profoundly," she said. He pressed his lips against her temple, and Thomas grabbed a handful of his father's collar, and the apple blossoms moved in the spring wind, white and insistent, along the fence line that had been planted for a future that was now unmistakably present. 2 months later, the Double L's southern pastures showed record grass growth due to the water access from the creek easement, and Harding sent a report that put the season's projected cattle sales at 30% above the previous year. Abel read the report at the kitchen table over breakfast and said, "The water rights are worth more than I originally estimated." Irene poured her coffee and sat down across from him. "Is that your way of saying the business arrangement was a sound investment?" He looked at her over the report. "It was the best decision I ever made," he said. "Though I want to be clear that I stopped thinking of it as an arrangement approximately 3 weeks in." "Week 4, she said. "Week 4, he agreed. Thomas, in his chair between them, was systematically dismantling a piece of bread toast with the focused attention of a person doing important work. "I've been thinking," Irene said. "You're always thinking," he said, which was accurate and not a criticism. "I've been thinking about the 30 East acres that Prout sold when he moved to San Antonio. The new owner has been running sheep on it and is not particularly interested in the property long-term. I've had a conversation." Abel set down the report and gave her his full attention, which was what he always did when she said "I've been thinking" with that particular tone, because, in his experience, it meant that Irene Bell Lawson had already solved a problem he hadn't known existed and was now ready to propose the next step. The 30 acres would connect the Bell property to the southern edge of the Double L's range, she said. "It would make the two operations contiguous for the first time, and it would double our effective water access area." He looked at her steadily. "You've spoken with Calder about the title." "I have. The title is clean." "And the price," she told him. He did the math in his head. She could see him doing it, and he nodded slowly. "The cattle sales from this season could cover it," he said. "Or we could split it from both property operating accounts." "I thought we might split it," she said, "since the benefit accrues to both." "Agreed," he said. They bought the 30 East acres in August of 1883, and with it, the Bell Lawson property became a coherent whole. The original 40, the 30 East acres, and the water access to the Double L spread 12 miles north, all legally connected and mutually beneficial in the way that Irene had originally calculated in the cold February arithmetic of her father's death and her own necessity. Only the necessity had become something else entirely in the passing of 2 years. The necessity had become abundance. Irene found that in the autumn of that year she was expecting again, which she told Abel in the same matter-of-fact way as the first time, and he reacted with the same uncomplicated joy. And Thomas, who was now 17 months old and increasingly opinionated, was not informed, but seemed to sense a change in the household atmosphere, and responded by becoming louder and more determined about the importance of his opinions. Which Abel said meant he was a Bell, and Irene said meant he was a Lawson, and they were both probably right. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1884, whom they named Clara for Abel's mother. She arrived with considerably less drama than Thomas had, and with an expression, Irene always said, of someone who had arrived exactly on schedule and found everything in order. Clara Bell Lawson was a placid, watchful baby who grew into a placid, watchful toddler, and then, somewhat explosively, into an extremely unplacid 3-year-old with strong views about horses and authority, which everyone agreed was pure Bell. In the summer of 1884, 3 years after the courthouse ceremony, and 2.5 years after the hearing that had confirmed the water rights and the land title, and as an entirely incidental byproduct of legal necessity, the fact that Irene Bell and Abel Lawson had stopped pretending their arrangement was anything other than what it was. Abel said something to her that she did not expect. They were on the porch in the evening, Thomas asleep inside and Clara nursing the beginning of a summer cold that had made her plaintive and clingy and finally fallen asleep on Abel's shoulder, and the sky was going from rose to deep blue over the western horizon. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "That first Thursday," he said, "when I rode down and you met me on the porch and we shook hands and you showed me into the kitchen with the deed papers and the coffee and the 14-point proposal you had written out by hand." She smiled. "It was 12 points. 14, he said with certainty. I counted. 12, she said, because she knew her own document. However many there were, he said. I sat across from you and listened to you lay it all out, and I thought two things simultaneously. First, this is the most sensible arrangement I've heard proposed, and it solves a real problem for both parties. Second, I have never in my life wanted to help someone succeed as much as I want to help this woman succeed. She looked at him. By week 4, I knew the first thing was true and suspected the second thing was going to be a problem, he said. Because the terms were what they were and you were very clear about them, and I was not going to be the man who complicated your practical solution with something you hadn't asked for. But you did, she said quietly. Eventually. I did, he said. Eventually. Because you told a courtroom that what was real between us mattered more than what the arrangement said, and I had been waiting for permission I didn't know I needed. Clara shifted on his shoulder in her sleep, making the small sound of a sick child reassuring herself that she was exactly where she should be. Abel, Irene said, I should tell you something too. Tell me. That proposal I made, the 12 points 14. The terms and the timeline and the legal structure of it, she said, ignoring him. I was very proud of it. I thought it was the most rational thing I had ever done. I thought it demonstrated exactly the kind of practical thinking that had been keeping me functional since my father died and my options narrowed to a very uncomfortable few. It was rational, he said. It was, she agreed. But the reason I wrote it to you specifically, the reason I answered your letter about the water rights with a marriage proposal instead of a counteroffer on the easement, which would have been the simpler arrangement, is that when I read your letter, something about the way you wrote it made me think you were an honest man. She paused. And I had been managing on my own for so long that what I needed most, underneath all the practical reasoning, was someone I could trust to be honest. He was very still. I didn't know that consciously when I wrote the letter, she said. I thought I was being rational. But I think part of me knew that what I was actually looking for was a person, not just a transaction. She looked at Clara asleep on his shoulder and at his hand braced gently against the child's back. I found one. He turned his head and looked at her with everything in his face open and present and exactly his, and he said, Yes, you did. She reached over and took his free hand and held it. And the porch was quiet and the sky was fully dark now, and the stars were coming out over the Texas plains in their careless abundance, exactly as they had on the night 3 years ago when they had sat on this porch for the first time together and not said half of what they were thinking. They were saying it now. Not in words, they had already used the words, but in the whole texture of it. The hand holding and the sleeping child and the sound of Thomas turning in his sleep inside the house, and the apple trees standing dark along the eastern fence line with another season's fruit already finished, and another season's growth already laid down for next year. The arrangement had been 12 months, or 14 points, or $2,000 and a water rights easement registered with the county. She had called it a business arrangement, and she had meant it when she said it, and it had been true for exactly as long as it took two honest people in regular close proximity to stop being honest only about the practical things and start being honest about everything else. He had called it the best decision of his life from the moment it stopped being an arrangement and became what it was. In the autumn of 1885, Irene Bell Lawson planted another dozen apple trees along the expanded southern fence line, the line that now bordered what had been Prout's 30 acres and was now simply the Bell Lawson South 40. She planted them with Thomas helping beside her, 4 years old and serious about it, pressing each seedling into the turned earth with the careful gravity of a child who has been told that trees take time and has decided to take that seriously. Clara, 2.5, sat on the fence rail supervised by Abel and narrated the proceedings with the authoritative commentary of a person who has strong feelings about everything and no reason to keep them internal. The Double L's cattle season that year was the best in its history. The Bell property's expanded acreage had been used to plant a proper kitchen garden, and a small hay meadow that reduced their feed costs significantly. The water access along the southern creek had been improved by a simple irrigation work that Abel and Pete Danning had put in over the summer, and the grass on both sides of the creek line was thick and green even in the dry months. James Calder, who had officially registered the Bell-Lawson property combination with the county in the summer, told them when they stopped in at his office to sign the final paperwork that he had been practicing law for 30 years and had very rarely seen a property dispute resolve itself into a successful consolidation of the parties. "Most of them end in someone leaving," he said. "We're not good at leaving," Irene said. "No," Abel agreed. "We're not." Calder looked at them over his spectacles with the particular expression of a man who has witnessed something improbable work out correctly. "Probably just as well," he said. The drive home from town that afternoon was the same drive they had made dozens of times in the past 4 years. Same road, same horses, same hills going ochre and amber in the autumn light. Thomas had fallen asleep against Irene's side and Clara was between them, occupying Abel's attention with a running inventory of every animal she had seen that day and her assessment of each one. "Rabbit," Clara said. "Yes," said Abel. "2 rabbits," Clara said, apparently amending the record. "I stand corrected," said Abel, in the grave tone he used with her which always made Irene want to smile. "And a bird." "What kind of bird?" Clara considered this with great seriousness. "A good one," she finally said. Irene did smile then, and Abel caught her smiling, and his whole face went warm in the afternoon light, and Clara continued her inventory uninterrupted, and Thomas slept with his head heavy against his mother's arm, and the horses walked on toward home with the patient certainty of horses that know the road. This was the life that had come from a letter answered in a dead man's study by a woman who was determined to be practical. This was the life that had come from a Thursday morning and 12 points, and a 4-minute courthouse ceremony, and a water rights easement and a business arrangement that had refused, from approximately week 4, to be only business. It was not what Irene Bell had planned. She had planned a transaction and an exit and a clear accounting of what was owed and what was gained, and she had planned to emerge from it alone and solvent and free, which had seemed at the time like everything she needed. She had gotten something instead that she had not had the imagination to plan for. Someone who had thought she was worth staying for before she was ready to know it, and who had waited, patient as the creek along the property line, for her to catch up. It had taken 14 months, or 12 points, or the time it took for a letter to go north and come back south again with an answer that said, "Bring the deed paperwork," in a hand she had learned to read as well as her own. By any measure, practical, legal, emotional, or agricultural, it had worked out. The apple trees would bloom again in April. The creek would run clear through the summer. Thomas would be starting school in the spring, and Clara had already declared her intention to learn to rope cattle before her 3rd birthday, which Abel said was ambitious, and Irene said was entirely realistic. There would be more to come. There was always more in a life lived on working land with a working partner who was also the person you loved most in the world. More seasons, more decisions, more mornings across the kitchen table with the coffee going, and the days list to divide. More chess games in the lamplight and more storms on the porch, and more of Thomas's serious small boy questions, and Clara's comprehensive opinions on the wildlife. More of the ordinary extraordinary thing that they had made together out of a practical necessity and an honest matching of 2 people who turned out to fit each other's lives as naturally as water finds its level. She had called it a business arrangement. He had called it the best decision of his life. They were both right in their way, and the arrangement, or whatever it had become, which was everything, went on.